What up, party people, and welcome to Countdown to Classic. This is a podcast that educates, informs, and gossips about World of Warcraft Classic. Each week we discuss the news, hot button issues, and content of the highly anticipated Classic servers. I'm your host, Josh Corbett, and this is a show where it's not my opinion on World of Warcraft that counts, but yours. If you're new to the show, Countdown to Classic goes through your expert input on everything relating to the short to be amazing World of Warcraft Classic. Today, we're jumping in the DeLorean and going back to the future as the show reviews a history of patches. Except we don't have Doc Brown riding shotgun. We've got someone better in Countdown to Classic regular dareal MarkyMark. After that, it's time for Calling Countdown as I touch base with Adam, aka MysticalOS of Deadly Boss Mods, for a chat regarding DBM in Classic, add-ons in general, and I also look to raise a bit of further awareness within the Classic community of what his personal situation is at the moment, if you hadn't heard through the grapevine already. Now, if you're enjoying these in-depth conversations that Countdown to Classic brings you on a regular basis, then please head on over to the show's Patreon page to see how you can help support Countdown to Classic continue to bring you more of the content that you're now so used to hearing on the show. If you want to hit me up with some feedback or submit a memory lane or anger management of your own, then you can always hit me up at feedback@countdowntoclassic.com as well. You can also support the show for free further by joining the show's amazing Discord, leaving a review on iTunes, and following the show on Twitter at Count2Classic with the number 2. All the links for everything I've just mentioned are in the show notes in each episode for you. If you can't get enough of me for some reason, then please do check out my other podcast, The Cinephiles. That's SINNERFILES.com, if you haven't already, for great comedic takes on all your favorite movies. But with all that said, let's fire up the flux capacitor and go back in time as we review a history of patches with dareal MarkyMark. All right, we've got another caller on the line now, and it's a Countdown to Classic veteran, dareal MarkyMark. How are you, mate?
I'm great, man. How are you tonight?
I'm good. Thank you so much for coming on. I think you're top of the leaderboard at the moment, with this being your third Countdown to Classic appearance.
Yeah, it's been going on for a while now. It's fun, so I don't mind coming on once in a while. It's a good time.
We love having you. The listeners love you, so it's all good, mate. We'll be looking forward to many more later down the track. Now, if people aren't aware, this is a call that's going to be all about the patch history of WoW, if you will. It's a very generic talk on all of the major patches that we got through vanilla. So later down the track on Countdown to Classic, I will be analyzing each and every one of these patches a little more succinctly. But just for now, this is some blanket coverage. And you're someone who highlighted to me last time we talked that you would love to chat about this. You know, going through the nuances of certain patches is something that you've always had a little bit of an interest in. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I'd say so. It definitely plays a role, and especially how Blizzard's going to deal with Classic and such. I think how they deal with the patches is a big deal. So.
Absolutely. Well, look, here's what I'll do. We're going to cut to the chase a little bit, because normally I would open an interview with, a history about you, but we've gotten that twice before already. So if everyone doesn't remember, go back and listen to Mark's other episodes. They're fantastic. You'll hear all about his resume within the game. But if you're not sure, he's a warlock and rogue veteran, an absolute vanilla, huge aficionado of the game, more private server based than actual vanilla days based. But it's all good at the end of the day. So just before we get into things, why don't you tell people where they can find you and your work online?
So my YouTube is dareal MarkyMark, and just YouTube, it should pop right up. And my Twitch, which I do stream on occasionally still, is twitch.tv dareal MarkyMark. I actually streamed a couple times recently for the first time in like a few months, because there's a new TBC server coming out. So I was kind of giving it a quick look.
I had seen grumblings about that one, and that was something I definitely wanted to see how people enjoyed. So you're planning on rolling on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I had access to the closed beta for like a week before the open beta started, which actually today the open beta just started. And I didn't really have a whole lot of time to play on it because I'm still playing on Northdale too on my warrior, but it feels pretty good so far. The core mechanics seem good, so definitely recommend checking it out.
Alrighty. Well, just to let everyone know, this is how the format of this episode is going to go. We've got 12 major patches to get through, and this will last around about the 90-minute mark. So what I've told Mark is we're going to go about 5, 6, 7 minutes on each patch, just a few quick questions, a few quick notes, and then we'll be moving along and chugging through all this content. And as I said, we'll come back and revisit all of the patches individually at another time. So let's start at the very beginning. The big one, patch 1.1, World of Warcraft. This dropped obviously on November 4th, 2004 when the game shipped. Now, with each of these patches, just for a bit of fun, here's what I'm going to be reminding people of. What was the number one song and the number one movie at the time? Well, back in the day, the number one song was My Boo by Usher and Alicia Keys. It started when we were younger, you were mine. And the number one movie was The Incredibles.
Woman, we are talking about the greater good. Greater good? I am your wife. I'm the greatest good you are ever gonna get.
So taking a trip back in time, Mark, I thought I'd open with a couple of quotes that I found on the WoW Classic subreddit, and they are the following quick ones. Firstly, from user Wish Doctor Song, who says this: I highly recommend reading through that whole list about patch 1.1 and rethinking your stance of being for it. The game was not a historic masterpiece. It was an in-progress MMO released too early, because that's how MMOs work. It was under constant development during its lifetime and ended up in a much better place than where it started. Following up with this post from user Septembers, who says this: remember one of the first things Blizz said is they want to give us a Blizzard quality classic experience? Well, 1.1 was an incomplete, buggy mess that people are going to make an absolute joke out of with any kind of serious content. I just can't see a professional developer with a reputation for their highly polished products and bug-free games releasing that in 2018. So, my question for you, Mark, is with what we know of patch 1.1 and what it was, what are some of your more loathsome features of patch 1.1 that we're potentially going to avoid if Classic does indeed drop with 1.12 as the starting point, as it has been alluded to?
Yeah, I think I've mentioned on previous episodes that I was on with you that I'm definitely a big proponent of starting with 1.12 because early versions of vanilla were so, I don't want to say bad, but just unbalanced in every way. So the biggest things would be the talent trees in 1.1. Most classes are just terrible. Warriors, rogues, mages, priests are extremely, extremely strong, and they are even in 1.12 with the updated talent trees. But they're even more so compared to all the other classes now as well, because all the other classes, warlocks, druids, etc., paladins, their talent trees are just horrendous for what the classes were, and so it really they really have some glaring flaws compared to the four, like, I guess, core classes you can call them. I feel like those are pretty standard classes for most MMOs, like a warrior, mage, priest, etc. So yeah, that'd be probably the worst thing about 1.1 would probably be the talent trees. Now, someone mentioned difficulty of the content. Content was definitely a lot more difficult in 1.1 though than it was in 1.12 because classes were worse. So they did less DPS, they did less healing, they had less everything for the most part, except for those four I mentioned. So things like raiding and such would be definitely more difficult in 1.1 than 1.12, although I doubt that it would be more difficult enough to the point where it would make a difference in top guilds clearing content any faster, any slower, really.
So when you talk about those four core classes being sort of night and day with the other ones in terms of strength, is it the fact that, as you seem to have said, the talent revamps that they eventually got were not that far of a leap for those particular classes from where they were in 1.1, and the other classes did get sort of such an overhaul that's why the bridge was so far in 1.1?
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. I think most of those classes had their core mechanics down for the most part. A lot of other classes were still missing a lot of their core abilities that they gained later on in vanilla so early on. Things like Mortal Strike for warriors was, I think it was 200% weapon damage. It was just insane. Like, they were so broken early on. So, I think it was 200%. Don't quote me. That's like 150 or 200%, but it's a huge amount. And, just things like that just made it super broken. Obviously, people didn't really realize that back then because we didn't have the skill and the knowledge that we do now when it comes to Classic. But nowadays, yeah, I mean, if you rolled on 1.1, it would be a joke for the most part because you really wouldn't see much besides those 4 classes.
Of the classes that you've highlighted as being not in a good state when the game released, is there one that instantly leaps to mind as sort of really being a bit undercooked and perhaps a bit recklessly released by Blizzard when the game came out?
I mean, probably the least popular classes, even still on private servers, are usually, well, almost definitely Druid's always the least popular class by far. Warlock is usually down there, at least on Alliance side. I know both their talent trees were horrendous. Like, Balance's 31-point talent was Hurricane, the AoE spell they have now. Resto's 31-point talent was Innervate, not Swift Mend. It was just, Warlocks had no death coil, so if there's a warrior or a rogue on you, you pretty much just died. Yeah, they were both pretty bad. Druid was probably the worst by far, I'm sure, considering people still think they're the worst class even now with 1.12 trees.
Now, have you rolled on many private servers that start in the 1.1 state?
Never. Every private server I've ever played for vanilla has always been 1.12.
Okay, so when I ask this question, I guess forgetting talents as much and inconsistencies between classes, we also talk about the fact that 1.1 just had far less content. Is there a small part of you that wonders or wishes to have played in that state of the game just in the simpler times?
Well, I mean, the content difference between 1.1 and 1.2 wasn't massive. I mean, there's a little bit more content added in 1.2, but we'll save that when we get there, obviously. I think 1.1 was only around for like a month or a month and a half or something like that. Obviously the game was simpler. There was less going on and people also knew a lot less. And I feel like WoW just felt different back then because it was such a brand new experience for everybody. Nobody knew what was going on. Everyone was just exploring, having fun, meeting people. Whereas the game has definitely changed from that in these days. People just play games differently as well these days, I think, too.
All right. Well, you've alluded to that patch 1.2, which you spot on. It came out a month and a half later. So patch 1.2, the mysteries of Moradon or Moradon, or I don't know. How do you pronounce it? Everyone pronounces this one differently.
Moradon, that's how I pronounce it.
All right. Okay. So you're with me, Moradon. Okay. Excellent. 18th of December, 2004. Number 1 song in the United States was Drop It Like It's Hot.
When the pimp's in the crib, ma, drop it like it's hot. Drop it like it's hot. Drop it like it's hot.
Snoop Dogg featuring Pharrell. Now, I distinctly remember getting quite drunk over beer pong in South Carolina and listening to that song over and over again. So, special place in my heart. Number 1 movie, Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events.
Enough isn't history. Let's go back in a time machine. Time machine. Time machine. 2 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. All the way to prehistoric times when dinosaurs ruled the earth.
So, some of the patch notes from this particular patch were, and this, I didn't know this first one, the ability to purchase mounts from other races. I didn't know that wasn't in the game from the start, so that's an interesting one. We'll get to that. The Gurubashi Arena is introduced. Warriors seem to have their threat addressed a little bit. The big one was Druid armor bonuses were massively buffed from in bear form 65 to 180% and in dire bear form 125 to 360%. And another interesting one that maybe I'll get you to comment on in a second is that Rogue's Vanish now breaks root and slow effects, which I think is a secretly huge one for them. Now, just in regards to patch 1.2, let's start with that first point I brought up, the ability to purchase mounts from other races, because I feel like this is something that became a big part of vanilla, because now when private servers seem to open, you find a lot of people just running to Teldrassil to get that rep up because they want the Night Elf mount. Do you think that this is this is a big sort of game opening ability, the ability to go worldwide and get whatever mount you want from your faction?
Yeah, I mean, I'll never I'll never forget, like on my old vanilla server on Gorefiend, I remember there was a male dwarf warrior. I forget his name. He was in one of the top guilds on the Alliance. And he had a black war tiger from, rank 11. And at least in that part of vanilla, which I actually didn't even remember, Northdale actually implemented this. You actually had to have the faction's reputation even to use the black war mounts. So like my orc warrior on Northdale, I had to get exalted faction with the trolls to ride the black war raptor. Whereas on previous servers, even for the black war mounts, they never implemented that there, which apparently is Blizz-like. So if you were a gnome and you didn't have exalted with night elves, you could still ride a black war tiger. It didn't matter. You didn't need the rep and the training for it, which I think is really cool. And I loved that back in vanilla as well. Because you would rarely see, at least on my server, you would very rarely see someone from a different faction on another faction's mount, or another race's mount, I should say. So seeing that was really cool. It made them really unique and really stand out. And you really remembered that person. Like I said, I'll never forget that dwarf warrior, because I thought it was so cool back then, because you really rarely saw that. And I think it's cool that they also added it into Northdale as well, because it also makes, at least for the ranking mounts, maybe not so much for the regular ones, because a lot of people know how to do it and do it these days to ride other races' mounts. But the ranking mounts are a lot more rare, especially cross race ones now. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Now, have you ever had much to do with the Gurubashi arena?
Honestly, not really. I mean, I know you can farm the PvP trinket for the shield and such from it, but I've never like really gotten into farming it or anything. No, honestly. I
found that, I mean, it's quite honestly an answer I was somewhat expecting, because it's something that I just, again, one of my fixations within the game is a game with so much content. There are still things within World of Warcraft that people just don't talk about a lot, probably because they're not doing it as much. So it's not like all of the content is 100% celebrated and people just go, oh my God, this game is so amazing. Everything's impeccable with it. Now, I don't doubt that the Gurubashi arena has been fun for people who have gotten involved. But what I'm saying is, tell me if you agree, it seems to me that the community hasn't really gotten behind it as much. And it's one of the more sort of slightly forgotten about areas of the game.
To an extent, yeah. I mean, I feel like if you're in Shanglethorn Vale and you're close and you see like the yell go off from the guy who runs it, the goblin, a lot of people will probably go by to give it a shot, but people aren't really going out of their way to go for it. Although someone in my guild recently just mentioned that we should start farming Gurubashi Arena for the trinkets, but about a few days ago he just mentioned that. But beyond that, you haven't heard about it in a while, because most people really aren't, like I said, going out of their way for it, like they are some other low-level things.
Now, educate me. What were these trinkets and what was so great about them?
If I'm not mistaken, it's just a PvP trinket that grants you a damage shield, basically.
Okay, no worries. Well, the next big point for me was, and this is something that comes up in a lot of YouTube videos when you see either patch history or talking about the evolution of druids, was that big change to their armor. And obviously it got buffed quite drastically. There would have been a lot of gripes, a lot of moans. I mean, there still are now about the ability of druids to tank. And I know I've spoken to listeners like Taladrill in the past, and I know previous caller Kef Tank might agree with this in terms of the fact that there are definitely ways in which druids can very competently tank a lot of the content in the game. Not so much raids, but more 5-man, blah, blah, blah. But before this buff, it would have been almost impossible for them to tank in any way. So what would you say this effect had on druids in the long run?
I think it was really important. It made them at least semi-viable in tanking raids. I know a lot of people think that Feral Druids tanking are kind of a meme. They're not really that bad. I mean, I was in a good guild on Lightbringer, and one of our off tanks is a Feral Druid. He never seemed to have issues dying. He never had issues with threat, as far as I can remember. It wasn't that long ago, maybe 6 months or so, when we were really farming AQ with him. So I didn't really have any complaints about him. Plus, if you're one of the top melee DPS, you get to get put in his group for an extra 5% crit, which no one's complaining about either. I don't think it's worth to bring more than one, probably, but you can definitely fit a Feral Druid into a raid comp if you really wanted to.
All right, and the last point, which is obviously quite pertinent to you, given that you've told us before that you have spent the majority of your time in the game as either a warlock or a rogue. I appreciate that you're leveling a warrior now, but that's in the past you've gravitated more towards warlocks and rogues. So with the rogue change that came in, can you tell people exactly how huge of a step it was in the subtle little note that says vanish now breaks root and slow effects.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a big deal. Before, it was a lot more difficult for rogues to break any kind of CC. You're kind of a lot more like a warrior at that point with a lot less mobility and ways to break out of any kinds of slows and CC. So now, all of a sudden, rogues have, especially if they have prep, 2 root breaks, basically, if they wanted to, which is massive, being able to stick onto your target. So I think it definitely changed the rogue class to be performing much more like they probably intended it to, as opposed to a warrior, which is a lot harder to connect with somebody on. But once you do connect, you're going to do huge damage pretty quickly. Whereas the rogue is usually a little bit more finesse behind playing it in PvP, and they're a lot more mobile now with that big change too. Definitely a big deal.
We'll move on to patch 1.3, Ruins of the Dire Maul. Came out on 7th of March, 2005. Number 1 in the charts was Candy Shop.
Still got the magic stick. I'm the love doctor. Hey, your fans teasing you about how sprung I got you. Wanna show me you can work it, baby? No problem. Get on top, then get to bounce around like a low rider. I'm a seasoned vet.
By 50 Cent featuring Olivia, and the number 1 movie was my boy Vin in The Pacifier.
Just because my mom is paranoid doesn't mean that we have to take orders from you.
Let me explain to you how the chain of command works. I tell you what to do, and you do it. End of chain.
So, what did this patch bring us? We've got Azuragos and Lord Kazak introduced as world bosses, meeting stones, dungeon player caps in certain dungeons, and then flowing on from that, we also had some changes to the ways in which misses are recorded and some respawn tinkering. So I'll start you off with this particular question. In terms of world bosses, and this is a chat that I'm going to be having a little bit later down the track with AK, who's been happy to put his hand up and come and chat in depth about world bosses. But how huge of an addition was it to give basically what would probably be an end raid boss just wandering around in the open world ready to crush noobs?
Yeah, I think it was a pretty awesome implementation into the game, honestly. I think back in like retail vanilla, it was probably less of an impact maybe because I don't think people, at least on my server, as far as I knew, people weren't try-harding as much as they do on private servers for world bosses. I think they definitely did create some awesome fights, especially if they spawned at like prime time and people found out. I'm sure people were recruiting for like raids and such, like in the world chats and in general chats. But I don't really recall them that much, at least on my server. I think it was a big deal. But I think it was a bigger patch on private servers though, because people are scouting the spawn timers. People know the exact spawn timers. People have summoning warlocks out there in these zones ready to go. So when the boss is spawned, they spam their discords with people to come, and they have their summoning, all start summoning their raids out there. And you have these huge PvP battles, like, versus a Horde and the Alliance for the guilds who are participating in these fights. And, it's a huge patch, I think, for private servers as well, with Dire Maul and the 2 world bosses. It's a really big deal. And I think it really starts to stir, like, not really guild drama, but like cross-faction, like shit talk and drama. It's a lot of fun.
You talked about the introduction of Dire Maul, and this is the first instance of a few. Obviously, we have things like Zolgarub as well comes up as in this conversation, but we talk about the somewhat notion of catch-up gear or gear that's just squeezed in just where they feel they might have left a hole if people were looking to progress, say, to Molten Core and things like that. Do you think that Dire Maul and its itemization, the loot tables, was necessary?
I don't think it was, I guess back then it was probably more necessary, yeah, just because, again, people's skill level was definitely significantly lower back then. People's knowledge of the game was significantly lower. People's PCs weren't just weren't as good. So like I remember being an MC on my family's Dell, I would lag like hell. I'd walk in Iron Fortress, it'd be lag like crazy. So all those factors add up to it. I think it was probably more necessary back then than it is now. I wouldn't really call it necessary now because you can clear MC and mostly greens and blues if you really wanted to. But the itemization in Dire Maul is quite good. Like Blizzard, I think they learned a lot between release and 1.3 because the itemization in Dire Maul is significantly better than a lot of other stuff that's in the game. Almost every class gets huge upgrades. There's a lot more hit on gear, a lot of plus healing, a lot of MP5 for healers. A lot more spell damage on gear. They did pretty good with it, so definitely a solid patch all around in my opinion.
All right, now I just want to read you one particular patch note which grabbed my attention and just see if you've got anything to say about it. You might not, but it definitely intrigued me, and Blizzard said the following in the patch notes. Previously, in many cases, a block, parry, or dodge was translated into a miss, thus causing confusion over actual miss rates. We've made the following changes in an attempt to be more clear as to what is actually happening in combat. Block. All creatures will now report a block on attacks from the front, reducing damage caused instead of converting the attack into a miss. Creatures will no longer be able to block attacks from behind. Dodge. Every time a creature dodges, it will report a dodge. We will no longer translate a creature's dodge of a rear attack to a miss. And parry. All creatures will now report a parry on attacks from the front instead of translating them into a miss. Creatures will no longer be able to parry attacks from behind. Now, my question for you, Mark, is this in relation to that. Is that I think that's actually a very, very big change. Again, just sort of subtly slipped in there in a way, even though they did explain it quite well. And my noob question is that very important because of things like add-ons that were added to the game where you need to see if, like, for instance, I know with a rogue, I need to know when I've parried in order to hit that riposte. So is this actually a really huge change for the game rather than just having misses come up all the time?
Yeah, I'm sure it affected the way things like I was thinking riposte, revenge, overpower for warrior, abilities like that worked. Probably worked a little more clunky prior to that change. Whereas afterwards, with the combat system and how they were recorded changing, they're probably a little more fluid, especially with add-ons and such as you said. It was probably easier to give you that notification to pop up or that big glowing thing on the button to, hit your riposte button or hit your overpower button. Definitely a big deal. It's a huge increase to melee DPS as well. Obviously, all melee stand behind bosses and stand behind mobs because they can't block, dodge, or parry. So that's a huge deal there as well. Also things like for block, like any kind of block mechanics that are going on there, like any thorium shield spikes or anything that increases, that does damage to the mob when a block has occurred. That was probably, again, a little more clunky prior to that patch as well. So definitely a big but subtle change for sure, like you mentioned. And I did miss too, dareal. I don't think it was really used back in the day, again, as far as I can remember, but also in private servers also introduces world buffs for you. So you have your 3 buffs from dareal for every raid. You get 15% extra stamina, 3% spell crit, and 200 attack power, which are huge buffs to your raid when you're making everybody go and get their DM buffs before every raid every week.
Of course, it's a very, very good point. Just one last quick thing on this particular patch. Did you know anything of, because one of the other little notes that grabbed my attention was that the respawns were actually tinkered with a fair bit in some of the instances. In particular, the respawn timing was increased so that obviously they weren't coming back as often in Stratholme and Scholomance, and which obviously would have affected the difficulty of instances in general. And I think there were a couple of other places that they tinkered with it. But I've got no doubt that this is something that was constantly addressed by Blizzard, because one of the funny comments that's been coming up in all these interviews with John Statz that have been popping up all over YouTube, and obviously he spoke with me as well. He mentions that, the World of Warcraft back in the day was viewed as the Care Bear MMO. It was a little bit easier than some of the other things that we had been exposed to. And yet here's Blizzard consistently trying to make it even a little bit easier. Do you think that these respawn times, let's say the respawn times as they were in 1.12, do you think it's all fine? Would you like to see it tinkered with even further?
I think they're fine the way they are, honestly. I don't really think it would make the game any a significantly easier, significantly harder if they were tinkered with at this point, just because, again, most people kind of know what they're doing, so instances go through pretty smooth for the most part. Obviously, occasionally you get your kind of crappy groups that just don't work out for whatever reason, but I think generally speaking, there's no real need for them to be tinkered with. Although I think definitely back in the day, it probably made a huge difference because you were definitely wiping a lot more in 5 and 10-man dungeons. Even back then, you could do Skolo as 10-man, you could do Strat as 10-man, or even, I think before 1.3 was unlimited, and then after that it went to 10-man.
Yep. So I've got the note was Oni and MC was finally capped to 40. It just says Blackrock Spire was capped to 15, and Diamore was capped to 5 in this patch.
Okay. Yeah, so it definitely made a big difference considering you're probably wiping a lot more, and respawns meant most of the time the group just gives up at that point. Most of the time your group's disbanding if you start getting respawns before you clear the instance, so it probably helped a lot back then. Nowadays, I don't think it would do a whole lot if people did increase the respawn rates again. But back then it definitely helped a lot with the newbier groups, which was pretty much everybody back then for the most part.
Okay, patch 1.4, The Call to War, 8th of April 2005. A dominating performance by your boy 50 Cent.
I take you to the candy shop.
Because Candy Shop is still number one, so good for you, 50. And Sahara is our number one movie.
We are looking for the doctor. Where are they? Where is the woman?
Sorry, I don't speak English.
You are speaking English now.
No, I only know how to say I don't speak English in English.
Now, the one thing that was big that we got with this patch, obviously the honor system. So I've got a question for you straight off the bat. Now, with this patch coming out, we're pre-Battlegrounds, but now here we are with the honor system dropped on us. Answer me my stupid question of the podcast. I don't see how big of a difference it would have made if there's no honor. Now, you'll have to tell me. I'm presuming there were no honor vendors at this point because there were no battlegrounds. So if you're out in the world and you're doing world PvP and you're not really gaining that much honor, basically I'm saying I don't really know what the go was. What was the scene? Why were we accumulating honor before battlegrounds? Were there vendors? Am I way off? What was the story?
So there at least should have been I can't remember specifically, but I'm fairly certain there were vendors, at least in Stormwind and Orgrimmar, for like your ranking items. Like rank 2 and up all get stuff. Well, I guess rank 1 gets a tabard too. Like rank 2 gets your PvP trinket, rank 3 gets cloak, etc. And then as you hit rank 7 and above, you start getting actual gear pieces. So I believe those vendors were in at that point, which is why they would have introduced the ranking system along with those vendors. Now you obviously would be missing the reputation vendors, which I think is what you're talking about. It's like the Warsong reputation vendor, the AB reputation vendor, and the AV reputation vendor all were obviously not in because this is pre-Battlegrounds. I don't know how much of an impact this might have had on the game back then. I mean, if you were to just without Battlegrounds, I think World PvP kind of continued on how it was. Like you still had your huge South Shore versus Terran Mill, even without patch 1.4, and people just killed the opposite faction because, well, they were Alliance and you were Horde, or vice versa. Whereas on private servers, I think it would have a huge impact if you were to release the honor system without Battlegrounds, because that means the rankers on the server are going to have to sit in the world for 16 plus hour a day, just ganking people mercilessly. And you can kill someone, I think it's like 5 times before they stop giving honor to you completely, or it might even be more than that. It's a fair share of kills though, so you would be camping lobies basically in the world until they gave you no more honor, just so you can try to hit your honor caps every week and continue ranking. So for private servers, I think it'd be a big deal. For retail vanilla back in the day, it probably wouldn't have been a big deal to do it without Battlegrounds.
Well, here's another big note that came in the patch, and a lot of people do talk about this one from time to time, and I'll just read the note itself. It says, a handful of spells were added to the list of spells subject to diminishing returns in PvP. It's our goal to set as few spells as possible to be diminished. We've identified this short list of spells as having durations and cooldowns sufficient to almost permanently slow or immobilize targets, but without adequate controls or other limiting factors. When a spell with diminishing returns is used against a target in PvP, the first effect has full duration. On the second use of the same category of spell, e.g. slowing, that spell's duration is reduced by 50%. On the third use, the duration is reduced by 75%. On the fourth attempt, the target becomes immune to the spell, blah, blah, blah. So the spells that were affected were Frost Shock, Entangling Roots, and Frost Nova. Talk about how huge this extension of diminishing returns was.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a big deal. Things like Entangling Roots, obviously everyone remembers the Frost Shock spam memes from the forums back in the day, how Shaman was overpowered because of Frost Shock. Entangling Roots, you can really just root your target for 100% of the time and not have to worry about it. They would just be sitting there and you couldn't really do much about it. Things like Fear, Polymorph, I'm not sure if they were taken care of prior to this patch or on this patch as well, but same thing there. I mean, if they didn't put diminishing returns on abilities like that, it would just not make it a fun game because someone could just polymorph you consistently and just keep you there as long as they really wanted to. Or if they start losing a fight, just polymorph you and keep you there. They can go drink and eat back to full and then come back and kill you again if they wanted to.
All right. Now, another thing that came up in this patch, Children's Week. Now, am I the only person that doesn't care about the orphans of war in a fantasy world? Did you ever have anything to do with Children's Week?
Not really, honestly. The only thing I ever have to do with most of these events, I should say, is that some of them do give you really good PvE buffs. Like I know the one for Valentine's Day, I forget the name of it, provides some really good food with insane buffs like spell power increases, hit increases, like some very strong stuff. But as far as I know, Orphan Week doesn't do anything for that. And so no, I was never really interested in it.
The next thing, where are we? Charm and Polymorph can now be countered by some class-specific abilities. For example, Druid Shapeshifting. I thought that was a rather important note as well, that now they're sort of introducing more and more ways for people to thwart CC.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
And we go on to some epic quests were added. I was very surprised the Paladin Mount epic quest line wasn't in the game from the start. So that was an interesting addition.
The Warlock wasn't either, as far as I know. I think they were both in the same patch.
Oh, they may well have been. Excellent. All right, we'll move on to patch 1.5, the Battlegrounds patch. And 7th of June 2005, We Belong Together by Mariah Carey is topping the charts. Madagascar is your number one movie.
Just smile and wave, boys. Smile and wave. Kowalski, progress report.
We're only 500 feet from the main sewer line.
And the bad news?
We've broken our last shovel.
And Battlegrounds, here we go. Warsong Gulch and Alterac Valley are introduced. Here's a big question for you, Mark. Do you think we should wait for Battlegrounds with Classic?
If the ranking system is in, definitely not. And the ranking system should definitely be in. Mostly because all the hardcore players will be very bored after Dire Maul release if there's nothing really going on and they don't have any ranking to do. This really gives a lot more of the hardcore players something to do and spend their time on the game still, so it doesn't become a raid log fest super early on in vanilla. It also gives the casuals something more fun to do because they actually get rewarded for their world PvP and such while they're leveling. And they can take a break from leveling, obviously, and go queue up for some Warsong Gulch or something, get some good items if they can start ranking up a little bit. I think it's super important for a server's health to have both of those things out together. And I think it would be a huge mistake just to have honor system and not Battlegrounds for the reason I mentioned before, because all your hardcore rankers are going to be mercilessly ganking lobies until they give them 0 honor again. Nothing personal, but if they want to rank, they got to do it. They have to get the honor any way they can, and I just think that's unhealthy for the game, considering it's going to be extremely frustrating for a lot of people.
Now, the other interesting point is something that I think a large number of the community gets up in arms about, and it is one of the more controversial topics that when people talk about changes versus no changes, things like that, this is the one thing that people are really crossing their fingers and hoping isn't in the game. And while some people might vouch for it, it seems to be a bit of a minority. And we're talking, of course, about dishonorable kills. So when we talk about DKs, tell me, are you for or against them in Classic?
I'm for them. I've never really had an issue with DKs. If you're smart about what you're doing, you really shouldn't have an issue with DKs either. There are some people I've seen on North there with like 150 DKs and they're like negative ranked. It's hilarious, honestly. If you're smart about what you're doing and you're ranking, if you're not even like seriously ranking, it's really not a big deal to have dishonorable kills in the game. And even if you are like a lower rank and you're starting to rank and you get a DK, it's again not the biggest deal. Unless you're like rank like 11 plus, then you get a DK. Yeah, that's going to hurt your RP for that week for your ranking. But beyond that, they're really not that big of a deal, and I'm for them being in the game. I thought you were going to ask me if I'm for the ranking system being in the game.
I'll go for that as well.
Probably one of the few, if the only thing I would be happy if Blizzard changed. I've ranked on previous vanilla servers, but not like I ranked on this server, and it's awful. I hated it. It's just such a grind. Not that I mind grinds, because I like vanilla, obviously, right? But this grind has 0 skill involved in it. Doesn't matter how good you are at the game. Anyone can hit rank 14 if you play enough. Doesn't matter if you play 16 hours or 20 hours a day. You can hit rank 14. The only difference is that the people who are better are going to be in a better pre-made, and they'll be honor capped earlier in the week. So instead of having to play, 80 hours, I'll have to play 60 hours. but it doesn't matter because that person who's really shit and is going to be playing the 80 hours a week, they'll still hit rank 14. It doesn't matter eventually. They might hit it a week or two later, but they'll still hit it eventually.
I'm with you in that I still always come back to this sort of dated reference somewhat, but I go, if we can put a man on the moon, we can come up with a better fucking ranking system. So,
yeah,
there's
it's just unhealthy too. It really is. Like they call it like generations rankers, like Gen 1 rankers are the first rankers on the server to hit high ranks, hit their rank 14, Gen 2, Gen 3, etc. So I was part of Gen 1 ranking for the first time this go around, and yeah, it's just not fun. 16 hours a day, 5 days a week. I basically worked for like 12 hours a day, 2 days a week to get my work done for most of the week, hopefully. And then from Wednesday to like Sunday, I pretty much wouldn't leave my computer except to sleep and eat. So it was not fun, and it's definitely unhealthy for most people too. So something I really hope Blizzard does change, because I don't really agree with the system at all. And obviously they didn't really know exactly how it would end up being either back then. So
did you say, was that the first time you'd ever seriously tried it?
I may have ranked on previous servers, but not till down the road from this point where you're still playing a shit ton, but it's not nearly as bad as it is this early on in the server with this many people trying to rank up, because the way ranking works is there are certain thresholds. So they have things called, I don't want to get into it too much, but you have honor caps every week, and each honor cap gets a specific amount of RP. So like the top rank gets 12 or 13k RP, then 12k, then 11k, etc. And so you have to hit these honor thresholds to make sure you don't lose RP and lose rank during these weeks. So it's just a whole lot of grinding, and it can be really frustrating at times too. So I wouldn't recommend it, but it can be fun. I made some great friends, but at the same time, it was also very frustrating too.
And how many boxes of Depends did you go through?
A few.
All right. Look, we'll move on to patch 1.6, Assault on Blackwing Lair. This came out on the 12th of July in 2005. And Mariah, still number one with We Belong Together.
Come back, baby, please, 'cause we belong together.
Good on her, a song she may or may not have been singing when she recently split up with Australia's richest man. War of the Worlds was the number one movie.
You can't see it, but everything we fire at them detonates too early before we can get close enough to cause any damage. When they flash that thing, everything lights up like Hiroshima.
There's more than one.
You gotta be kidding me, right?
And more importantly, we were introduced to Blackwing Lair. Also, though, and something that I want to start with focusing on, is we had the introduction of Battle Masters. Now, we've obviously just spoken about, whether we spend some time in Classic without Battlegrounds. What do you think about spending a bit of time in Classic without Battle Masters?
I didn't mind that. We actually didn't have them right away on Northdale either. So if you were pre-meeting like we were, one person basically had to be at the portal to queue you, and then obviously you would come out of the battleground at the queue spot. I didn't mind it as much. It's not that big of a deal. Fellwood's pretty close by for both factions, so you can go up there and pick some herbs or mine or do some world PvP while you're waiting for your next queue if you have a wait time. I didn't mind as much. Obviously, it's a lot more convenient to have Battle Masters. But generally speaking, I didn't mind not having them either. It's not the end of the world.
All right. Now, this is also the first patch where we started seeing the major class overhauls. And the subjects of this particular overhaul were warlocks and warriors. So, obviously, we've got you here. You're playing warrior at the moment. You've also got a lot of knowledge about warlocks. Let's start with the warlocks and talk about the changes that they went through. They got, significantly tinkered. Their demon skin, demon armor, demonic sacrifice. The master demonologist was introduced as a talent in the demonology tree. Talk to us for a little bit about how big of a patch this was for warlocks.
Yeah, it made them not completely terrible for pretty much the first time in the game. They had a lot of huge talent increase, changes and revamps. I'm pretty sure Death Coil might have been implemented at this point. Which actually gave you somewhat of an out versus melee when they connected with you, rogues or warriors. It was just a huge deal all around for warlocks, both in PvE and PvP. It gave them a lot more options for their specs as well. It opened up a lot of avenues, and it was definitely a huge blessing for warlock players back then, including myself. I don't think I really realized how bad my class was when I was playing it back in vanilla, but, these changes definitely made a big difference.
Too easy. I don't think this was the Death Coil patch. It might have been another one.
Okay.
I'm not quoting you on that one.
I was thinking it might have been a little later, so I wasn't exactly sure.
All good. Yeah, I just can't see it in the notes there, but a number of things obviously got done. But what did you think about, as I said, this was the first patch that really started absolutely deconstructing some classes and just making the gameplay a fair bit different. Do you think that if we were, look, and people talk about whether or not we'd go through this for Classic, and there were a lot of people asking for patch 1.1 and doing everything as it was back in the day. It would have been quite a culture shock to gameplay a little bit for people playing these classes, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, like I mentioned before, I don't think many people would be playing anything besides Warrior, Priest, Mage, and Rogue, just because the other classes were so bad. There's really not much reason to bring them. Like, you'd probably bring 2 Warlocks to a raid. You'd bring 1 Druid, maybe just for buffs. Things like that, and everything else would be stacked with Priests and Warriors and Rogues, which isn't completely different than it is in 1.12, but at least the other classes have an actual role in the raid, whereas back then they really wouldn't bring much at all to the table.
But in terms of playing those classes, that let's say you're playing that class around that time of that patch when it gets overhauled, you're now, whether you're a theory crafter or not, you're now changing rotations, you're relearning the way in which you play your class. Wouldn't that be right?
Yeah, to an extent, I think, yeah. I don't think Blizzard really changed a lot of the core stuff for most classes, but at least the talent tree revamp made a huge difference. You know, relearning your talent points, doing some research trying to figure out what's best and how you want to play and your specific play style. I think that would definitely have a huge effect for sure.
Here's a really interesting one that I did not know about, and I would wonder if you knew this one. Will of the Forsaken was changed in that the lasting immunity effect was decreased to 5 seconds as it is now. So I had no idea that what many people call one of the best abilities in the game, or at least the strongest racial, I think the majority of people would suggest, was even stronger once. I didn't know it was nerfed. What was it, 10 seconds?
I think it was like 20 or something insane like that.
Holy shit.
It was absolutely broken, yeah. I think it was something close to 20. It was up there, though. I don't think it was 10. It was up there, if I'm remembering correctly. It was a long time.
I mean, talk about, as you say, it's broken, but I mean, talk about what would have happened if Undead was still walking around with a 20-second Will of the Forsaken today.
Yeah, everybody would be undead. I mean, there's still a lot of undead on Horde side for sure, but it may be the ratio would be even higher for sure by a significant amount.
Definitely. Okay, let's move on to patch 1.7, Rise of the Blood God, 13th of September 2005. Mark, can you guess who the number one, or what the number one song was here?
I have no idea, but I think it's really cool that you're doing this.
Well, you don't have to stretch the imagination too far, because guess what? It's your girl, Mariah, again, still killing it.
Wait a minute, this is too deep. I gotta change the station, so I turn the dial, trying to catch a break.
I know, right? She's unstoppable. She's a force of nature. Anyway, well, I'll ask you this one, Mark. What's your favorite Mariah song, and why is it fantasy?
Can't name one, honestly. But I guess I'll say fantasy.
All right. So, well, now I can't ask you to sing the words to fantasy with me. That's right. We'll save that for a special call another time.
I would have loved to.
All right. The number one of the movie was The Exorcism of Emily Rose, an absolute favorite of mine.
Ancient serpents, depart from this servant of God. Tell me your 6 names. We are the ones who dwell within.
So let's talk about what happened in this patch. Now, obviously, Zul'Gurub introduced. We talked earlier about the notion of catch-up content. Do you think Zul'Gurub in Classic, let's say, look, how should I word this so that people don't jump up and down even though they know I'm a complete noob? With Zul'Gurub, let's say that is, for some reason, there at Classic at the start. Now, I'm not suggesting that everything would be dropped when Classic drops. I know that obviously you've got to have some kind of a progression. You've got to go through Molten Core, BWL, onwards and onwards onto Nax. But if Zul'Gurub were available at the beginning of the game, how problematic would that be for Classic?
I think it would definitely be a big deal. You're adding in another world buff 15% all stats and increased movement speed to your entire raid for every raid whenever you pop your heart, which is every week pretty much from Hakar. You get the huge spell damage trinkets. You get the Bloodvine set for casters as well, which is massive with all the hit and crit on it. It's Bisp till next Ramus, which is huge for most classes at least. It's a big patch, actually. There's a lot of gear that comes out of Zul'Gurub that's pretty strong, especially if you're considering like pre-Bisp grinds. There's a lot of strong pre-Bisp gear in Zul'Gurub if you haven't been raiding for a while yet that you'll be replacing some pieces with. So it would probably not be the best thing to release it right away because there is so much that helps every class to become even stronger and already easy content for the most part.
Okay. We also got introduced to Arathi Basin, which is secretly my favorite battleground. What are your thoughts on AB?
I don't mind AB. I think it was a lot of fun when I was ranking on North. There's a lot of strategy that goes into it, and it's played a lot differently than other battlegrounds with proper rotations. And, everyone has like hundreds of noggin foggers on them so they can slow fall. So, like every class can slow fall from like Lumber Mill down to Blacksmith. It's pretty cool stuff, like the way the meta's evolved around battlegrounds like that. I don't mind it. I think it's probably better than Warsong because people can turtle Warsong if they want to. You can't turtle AB. AB is going to end in a specified time no matter what you do. Warsongs can last forever sometimes, so I probably would prefer, at least when I'm ranking, to Warsong. But if I had to choose one just for fun, I'd probably choose Warsong over AB for pure fun, in my opinion at least.
Okay, now Hunters got their overhaul here, and I'm not sure exactly how much experience you got with Hunters, but they got a bit of pet customization, and the survival and BM trees were quite overhauled. So do you know much, and feel free to say if it's not quite your field of expertise, do you know much about what happened to Hunters here?
I'm not exactly certain. I have to assume Wyvern Sting was added in for the 31-point survival time, because I know survival was like a melee tree, I think, before this. Mm-hmm. Or like more geared toward a melee hunter tree before this, until they revamped it to be more of a, CC kind of tree, basically, with a lot of survivability and CC involved in it. And I assume they added like Bestial Wrath and stuff into Beast Mastery, which is not fun. I'm remembering it now because it's not fun on fresh vanilla servers, hunters having those abilities, because they're so strong early on with Lupos and Bestial Wrath. It's just insane.
Okay, another interesting thing, Stranglethorn Fishing Extravaganza. That's what we got with this patch. Were you much of a fisherman?
No, not at all.
Okay, fair enough. Well, what is it, the more pertinent question for you might be then, what is it that keeps you away from fishing? Do you think that the rewards aren't there? Do you think the mechanics are just, it takes too long? What makes you say, fuck that?
Yeah, I just find it kind of boring, honestly. I know some people really enjoy it, and you can actually make some pretty decent gold fishing, especially during certain times of year when certain fish are in season, like the squid for the 10 agility food buff and stuff. You can make a good amount of cash doing it, but I always just found it extremely boring. I never really just tried doing it while like watching Netflix or something on my other monitor, so maybe that's something to give it a go. But I never really give it a real try either, I wouldn't think so.
It's something that's always intrigued me, and obviously you have, people that use it also as a quiet moment. I know obviously you've got Fishing with Krendor, where he goes fishing with people and interviews them. I always thought I'd mix it up a little bit differently, though. If I did interviews when Classic dropped, it'd be like dueling with Josh, and there'd be a lot of fucks and shits and C-bombs getting dropped during the interviews. Just to mix it up. Now, yeah, we'll move on to patch 1.8, Dragons of Nightmare. And this was released on the 10th of October in 2005. And number one song, pre-Kardashian Yeezy, Gold Digger.
18 years, and on her 18th birthday, he found out it wasn't his. Now, I ain't saying she a gold digger.
Your boy, you surely got to have some love for that song.
Of course. Oh, yeah. That brings back memories.
Oh, man. I want to meet the person.
Way back in the high school days.
Oh, yeah. Is this like, sophomore year or something for you? Like 15-year-old Mark trying to bump and grind with the ladies to this song?
05. I was a freshman in high school, so yeah, pretty much.
There you go. All right. Now, the number one movie was Wallace and Gromit, The Curse of the Were-Rabbit.
Vicar! Oh, where the devil is he?
Do you want to confess?
I want to talk to you about the beast.
Everything you need to know is in this book.
non-wrestling. No. I meant this one.
And we got, in World of Warcraft, 4 corrupted dragons, Lethon, Emerus, Isandre, and Teyra. I hope I've said some of them at least mildly correctly. Now, I'm going to show my cards a little bit here. I know next to nothing about the Dragons of Nightmare that were dropped into the game at this point. Can you tell us a bit more about them?
Yes, there's 4 of them, obviously. They're all in the same... They all spawn at the same time when they do respawn. So I believe with the way it works is when the last dies is when the timer starts. And from that point on, you have whatever, I think 72 hours or something, until the window opens again. Now you have, for all the world bosses, including Emerald Dragons, you have a window between X and Y time that they have to spawn in. And so they're going to spawn in 4 zones: Duskwood, Feralas, Hinterland, and which one am I forgetting? How am I forgetting this? I killed them so many times in the last server. Ashenvale is the last one.
That's the one.
So you have them spawn. They're all going to spawn at the same time. And obviously, particular ones are easier for other factions. Ashenvale is super close to Orgrimmar for Horde. Duskwood is super close. And Hinterland to a little bit of a lesser extent for Alliance as well. Although it's also close to Undercity, but just less of a popular city, obviously, than Orgrimmar is. They're a lot of fun. They drop some really strong gear. All the world bosses drop strong gear, but the Dragons of Nightmare are really good too, because they drop some extremely good nature resistance gear, which is necessary, especially for tanks and melee going into AQ40. So fighting for these Dragons is kind of a big deal, especially for top guilds if they really want to push server first AQ40 and such, and just makes your progression a lot easier. Having these really strong items to get in there. And there's some other decent items too, but I think the NR pieces are the biggest ones on the Dragons of Nightmare for the most part.
Now, we also got Hallow's End introduced to us here, and we talked about how both of us sort of didn't particularly care for Children's Week. This was another event that was introduced into the game, and I can tell you that personally, before the Burning Crusade and obviously the revamp that came, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure it was in the Burning Crusade when we got the Headless Horseman over at Scarlet Monastery. That was something that intrigued me. But before any of that, the Hallow's End things just, again, really didn't bother me at all. I didn't care about them.
I think back, like, in the day, I definitely cared more about these things because it was fun. I'd never experienced it before. They had cool, just quirky, fun stuff that you can go around the world exploring with your buddies and just checking out, like, what kind of loot they drop and stuff. Again, these days I don't care for them as much. I think it is during Hallow's End. There's, I think, like, the Burning Man is outside of Undercity. Yep. I'm pretty sure it's during Hallow's End, and it provides a sick raid buff. It lasts about an hour, I'm pretty sure. It lasts an hour. And it's really good buff to get before a raid if your guild really wants to try hard and really push things to their absolute limits. So that's cool. But beyond that, I don't do a whole lot with Hallow's End these days either.
And the Headless Horseman was sorry, not was it the Headless Horseman? That's just what I refer to him as.
And SM Graveyard, I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, and that was in Burning Crusade, right?
I think so, yes.
Okay. Now, I just want to read you the following note, and I want to read it to you because I don't understand fully what it's saying. So either you'll get it and you'll explain it to me, or you might be like, yeah, I'm not too sure what they're saying either, but just bear with me through this one. So the note goes as follows, and it's about instant attacks. The mechanics of most instant melee attacks have been modified to improve item balance. Previously, instant melee attacks did damage based on the damage range of the weapon, plus a bonus for the player's attack power. This bonus was then multiplied by the speed of the weapon. As a result, slow weapons did more damage than was intended, and fast weapons were considered inferior by most players. We've changed the way the attack power bonus is calculated for instant attacks. This change does not affect attack power calculations for normal melee attacks. Instead of multiplying by the speed of the weapon, the attack power bonus is now multiplied by a fixed number pulled from the following table. Two-handed weapons 3.3, daggers 1.7, all other one-handed weapons 2.4. As a direct result of this, many weapons have shifted position in their relative power. In particular, many epic quality items are now more powerful than blue weapons. This change was not made to reduce the power of instant attacks, but to correct the relative imbalance of weapon itemization. At a given level requirement, epic quality weapons should always be more powerful than superior quality weapons. So, my question for you is, I don't know what the fuck they're telling me there. I sort of know what they're saying. Can you explain that in a bit more of a layman's term for me?
I think basically what they're saying is that, well, even still nowadays, at least in your main hand, for the most part, you still would prefer slower weapons as opposed to fast ones because they are going to do more damage still. I think what they're just saying is that back then, the way the calculations were done, slower weapons were so much stronger than faster speed, like weapon speeds, that there was really no point to ever using faster weapons. I believe they're talking mostly because they're main hand, because they said not for regular attacks. They're saying it's mostly for specials. So things like Bloodthirst, Sinister Strike, maybe Mortal Strike, things like that would be affected by this change. But even still, these days, you are still looking for slower weapons to use over faster ones because your yellows still do more damage with your slower weapons with or without these changes. Like my current one-handed weapon on my Fury Warrior on Northdale is 2.9 speed. That's long as hell for a one-hander, but it also does insane damage, especially with Bloodthirsts because of the way the calculations are done. So I'm not sure exactly what they changed, how much they changed it, and what kind of effect it had, or even if it really did what it was supposed to do, because we're still using slower weapons in our main hands these days, as opposed to faster ones. And on top of that, there are still plenty of blue weapons that are better than epic ones too. There's a lot of really shitty epic weapons in the game.
Yeah.
So.
All right, well, let's move on. And sorry, just as a final note, Druids were the class that got an overhaul in patch 1.8. But unless you've got anything meaty to say about that overhaul, I might move on. Is there anything noteworthy from what happened to Druids there?
I mean, they don't have Hurricane and Innervate as 31-point talents anymore, so that's good. Beyond that, I don't know exactly what they changed, but the the revamps were huge, considering their 31-point talents were complete jokes before that.
All right, well, let's go. Patch 1.9, The Gates of Anchorage, 3rd of January, 2006. Back at the top of the charts, guess who it is?
Don't forget about it. Don't, baby, don't let it go. No, baby, no, baby, don't get it now. Don't, baby, don't let it go.
Mariah, she's back with another, of course, she's back again. Don't forget about us. She's like The Grudge. So I looked it up. Are you familiar with the movie The Grudge?
Yeah.
All right. So I looked up the wiki sort of description of The Grudge for people who don't know if you haven't seen the film. So it goes like this. The Grudge describes a curse that is born when someone dies in the grip of a powerful rage or extreme sorrow. The curse is an entity created where the person died. Those who encounter this supernatural force die, and the curse is reborn repeatedly, passed from victim to victim in an endless growing chain of horror. Does that sound like a pretty apt description of Mariah Carey?
Maybe.
It might fit. All right, number one movie, The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Welcome, Peter, son of Adam. Welcome, Susan and Lucy, daughters of Eve. And welcome to you, Beavers. You have my thanks.
I'm sure some World of Warcraft fans might be a fan of that particular piece of work. Now, the AQ War effort. We got it. We got linked auction houses. Now, that's the one I actually want to focus on first. Talk about how big and convenient it was, and actually whether you're for or against linked auction houses.
Oh, definitely for it. I mean, not having linked auction houses is awful, considering you get to go to the other cities to see different things on different auction houses. I can't believe it took them this long to do it, though. Like, it took them over a year to implement.
It's shocking, isn't it?
Pretty wild, yeah. I mean, just thinking about it these days, like, man, if you didn't have a linked auction house, even for the first month of the server, it would suck. I do think it's important because it allows the economy to flow better. More people are seeing your items and buying them and vice versa. Super important. Definitely think it was a good change.
See, I started playing around this time, and so I never experienced unlinked auction houses. And all I think about realizing that they took so long to implement it is, as you say, I would have gone out of my mind because I was an auction house freak. I spent so much fucking time at the auction houses. I would have died from, FOMO. Like just the absolute fear that I would have been running from capital city to capital city, just fear of missing out on some awesome item. It would have driven me up the wall. But
I definitely think it made a big difference for any auction house aficionados out there who were trying to make as much money as they could and playing the economy and stuff. definitely made a huge difference out having linked auction houses.
Here's an interesting one. Multiple battlegrounds queues. So I didn't realize that, I'm guessing that you could only queue for one battleground.
Yep, prior to that.
That sucks.
Yeah, it was definitely a welcome change back then for sure, considering your server populations were like capped at 2,500 roughly, give or take a little bit. So, your queues can get pretty long sometimes. So being able to queue for multiple at a time was, I think, important to kind of keep the battlegrounds alive.
Now, Paladins are the class that got their overhaul. Do you know too much about what happened to them?
No, Blessing of Kings was a 31-point talent and protection, which is a joke as well. 31-point talent and retribution, I think it was actually. So that got changed over to repentance. That was a huge deal. Beyond that, I'm not exactly sure. All I know is Blessing of Kings was a 31-point talent, which is crazy. So that was a good change for Paladins.
Here's one that we've touched on very briefly before, again, pertaining to Warlocks. I'm kind of shocked that this took so long to come around. The introduction of shard bags or soul bags.
Yeah, before you had to keep your shards in just regular bags, regular sized bags too, considering shard bags are significantly bigger than regular, just your traveler's backpacks and such. So that was a huge difference for long walks to carry more soul shards at a time. And I think for Paladins too, Paladins got 15-minute blessings, I think, which is huge in this patch, considering you're buffed for 5 minutes until 1.9, which is awful. So that was a welcome change too, I'm sure, for them.
I've got another massive noob question because I've been playing a Warlock recently and I've been liking it a lot more than I ever planned on. And it's so much so to the point that I'd locked myself in for a priest for Classic, and now in the back of my head I'm like, fuck, I'm really loving Warlock. I'm not sure what to do now. But here's my stupid question. With regards to shard bags, I don't quite understand how it works in terms of, does a shard bag take up a bag slot so you are then removed from carrying as much stuff as other classes, or does it work within your bag? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it does take up a bag slot, so it's like a hunter's quiver or ammo pouch. You are going to have less room in your bags than other classes will, correct?
Oh, well, that makes me think twice. All right, now here's the last interesting point from patch 1.9, and I won't talk too much about obviously what happens with the AQ war effort. We've touched on that a lot on the podcast, so listeners can go back and hear what the show has had to say about that in the past. But the raid calendar system, and I'll read you the note. The raid lockout system has undergone a significant change. The new system will have all instances reset at a certain server time, regardless of when you were actually saved to the instance. The reset schedule is as follows. Molten Core every 7 days, Blackwing Lair every 7 days, Onyxia 5 days, Zolgarub 3 days, AQ 47 and Temple of AQ 20 every 3 days. All resets will occur during off hours when the least amount of raids are active, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so Mark, what I'd ask you, those times that we just heard and the raid lockout system, do you think it's a great system as is? Would you want any of those timings reduced, increased, or all is good?
No, I think they did actually a great job with that back in vanilla. I think 3 days for AQ and ZG is good, especially for ZG, considering that you have to do your rep grind for ZG to exalt it for your shoulder enchants. And it's not like the gear is so powerful, you're going to be replacing most of your gear from like MC and Blackwing Lair and AQ. You're really not going to be replacing most of it for a couple pieces here and there. So I think that's good, especially better for more casual guilds too. You need a little bit of catch up at this point, compared to guilds who might have been raiding for months and months prior to them at this point in the game. So I think all in all, Blizzard actually did a really good job with this.
All right, patch 1.10, Storms of Azeroth. 28th of March 06, So Sick by Neo is at the top of the charts. And
I'm so sick of love songs, so tired of tears, so done with wishing you were still here.
people might be getting so sick of these updates, but it's my show and I like it. And Mark said he liked it, so shove it up your ass. V for Vendetta is the #1 movie.
Voila! In view, a humble vaudevillian veteran, cast vicariously as both victim and villain by the vicissitudes of fate. This visage, no mere veneer of vanity, is a vestige of the vox populi, now vacant, vanished. However, this valorous visitation of a bygone vexation stands vivified, and has vowed to vanquish these venal and virulent vermin, vanguarding vice and vouchsafing the violently vicious and voracious violation of volition.
And we got tier 0.5 armor sets. Tell us what you thought of these when they came out.
Yeah, so these made those armor, like your Shadow Crafter jump, it's not completely garbage compared to other pre-BIS pieces. They're still not the best pieces out there, but they're decent enough. There's a few, like I think a few items become BIS for some classes. Like I know the Warrior boots are really strong. A few things like that come to mind. It was a really expensive and long process to convert your regular set to the tier 0.5 set. But the gear looks different. If you're into something for the fun or just like the RP of it, it's good. And there's a few BIS items, as far as rating goes, that come from it as well. I don't think there's many, but there is a couple, like one or two, I think.
And something I was confused about, maybe you know a bit more about it, maybe not, the weather effects. People are going on about, the weather effects that were brought in 1.10 is beautiful. Certain zones like Winter Spring and Elwyn Forest, we got changing weather. I mean, you do notice it in game at times, and it's lovely, but I mean, it's not like make or break for me at times. I know it increases the aesthetic, and I think WoW is a beautiful game regardless, but I guess it throws you in that immersion as well, which is great.
Yeah, it definitely increases your immersion. It's a cool feature that was added. If Blizzard removed it in vanilla, I wouldn't blink twice and still play the game if they didn't mess up anything else. But I think it's cool to add some ambiance to zones, like you mentioned, like Winter Spring, Elwyn Forest, like Dun Moreau. Like, there's more iconic zones with those soundtracks. Starts snowing or raining while you're there. It is some cool stuff.
Now, Priests got their overhaul in patch 1.10. You already talked about how they started the game in a relatively good position. Do you know much about what happened with their big talent overhaul?
Honestly, I really don't know what changed much in the Priest talent overhaul.
That's all right. Not a worry. I know you don't have a boatload of experience with the class, so I won't hold you or put you to task there. Let's move on. Patch 1.11, Shadow of the Necropolis. Now, 20th of June, 2006. Hips Don't Lie, Shakira.
Oh, baby, when you talk like that, you make a woman go mad.
That's at the top of the charts. Did you practice your dance moves to that one back in the day?
Oh, yeah, of course. In the mirror every night before bed.
Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest. And yes, I say Caribbean because I'm Australian. We don't say Caribbean.
Alas, my children, this is the day you shall always remember as the day that you almost... Captain Jack Sparrow.
And Nax obviously was introduced to the game, which was fantastic for all you hardcore raiders out there. And Mages and Shaman got their big overhaul. Now, Shaman, not as much. I've talked on the show before about how Shamans were waiting and waiting for their big overhaul. And I don't think they were overly pleased with what they got. Do you know much about either the Mage or the Shaman changes?
I honestly don't, but if Shamans didn't get a huge overhaul of their talents, that means they were in a pretty decent spot for most of the game then, honestly. I mean, Elemental is really strong in PvP, Resto is really good in PvE, Enhancement is kind of meh in both, but back in the day, people didn't really know how to play very well, so Enhancement could have done a lot more than it does nowadays. But if they didn't get a huge overhaul, they weren't in an awful spot early on.
Now, just a quick alternate world. Could you imagine, I mean, obviously, Nax came out in this patch, and that became what was known as the last dungeon, the last boss, the end game of vanilla WoW. Can you imagine if we never got that in vanilla and we were just left with AQ40 essentially as our final raid? How would you feel about that?
Well, I guess if back then we didn't know about it and it never happened, we wouldn't make a difference, right? But I guess nowadays, since we do know, I feel like it would just feel incomplete without it. Like AQ is a good and a fun raid, and it definitely is significantly more difficult than Black Lair or Molten Core. But I think the difference between AQ and Nax is pretty huge. There's a lot more bosses, a lot more mechanics. It's a huge raid instance with a lot of incredibly strong gear. It's definitely like an iconic piece to vanilla. So I think it is very important for it to be in the game, and it would definitely suck if it wasn't.
Yeah,
everyone remembers how difficult it was back then, and how few guilds ever even went into Naxxramas. Never mind killed even a couple bosses. I remember my guild back then. I think we killed like 2 or 3 bosses, which was a huge accomplishment back then, compared to most other guilds. And so even just being in Nax at that point was just cool as hell.
I think that lore-wise, it was a fantastic endpoint for, if you'll call it the story of vanilla World of Warcraft. Just given that, we wind up in the Plague Lands, for the most part when you're going around 60, and then there's this large floating place above you, and you get the tie back to Warcraft 3 with Kel'Thuzad and things like that. I mean, people might have been clamoring for Arthas as somewhat of an end boss of vanilla, but obviously there's only so much content you can put in. So I think it ended in a really good spot.
Yeah, and with Kel'Thuzad, it's really tied into Arthas and the Frozen Throne and everything from Warcraft 3. So it was definitely a good ending point. I think it kind of wrapped things up decently for heading into the Burning Crusade. As far as these things go, and a lot of the things from Warcraft 3 kind of did carry over into the lore, into World of Warcraft vanilla, so that was pretty cool to see too, since Kel'Thuzad plays kind of a crucial role in Warcraft 3.
All right, well, let's one quick note just before I move on to the last patch. And in patch 1.1, we got this one. Tell me your thoughts. They said, the cost to unlearn talents will now decay over time. This cost will be reduced by a rate of 5 gold per month to a minimum of 10 gold. So it sounds like obviously they've tried to alleviate the expense of consistently changing your talents, which was something that hardcore raiders really would have felt, helped them out a little bit. Can you talk about the spot that we're in with Vanilla World of Warcraft in 1.12 in terms of the cost of, resetting the talents and everything? Do you feel that it's fair? Do you feel that it should be changed in Classic WoW? Because a lot of people are sort of grumbling for that.
Yeah, I think it's a minor inconvenience at the end of the day. I think it is an important gold sink for people, considering your raid spec and your PvP spec are, generally speaking, very different from one another. So I think it's an important gold sink for people to put in there, because otherwise the amount of extra gold that would be in the economy every week would just be astounding. If all of your raiders weren't respecing to PvP specs or farm specs after all their raids. So I think it is super important. At the end of the day, 50 gold is about an hour's worth of farming for most classes. It's not the end of the world. So if you have enough time to raid every week and you're going to respec for farming or for PvP, the extra hour you have to put in to farm up your 50G to respec the first time is, I think it's important.
All right, well, here we go. We've made it to the end. Patch 1.12, the Big Daddy, Drums of War, 22nd of August, 2006. Number one song, London Bridge by Fergie.
When I come to the club, step aside. Pop the seats, don't be heavy in the line. VIP, cause you know I got a shot. I'm Fergie Ferg, give me love you long time.
Holy shit.
Yeah, I know, right? I'll tell you a funny story real quick, actually. I was lucky enough to meet Fergie at a party in New York City, right around this time. It was actually the year before, in about September 2005. I got to go to a private little get together of record executives and sort of assorted hangers on through a friend of my sister's. And we went there, and the Black Eyed Peas were all there. And it was funny because all the guys were sitting down, chilling and drinking, and had just, girls hanging off them everywhere, blah, blah, blah. Fergie was the only one, working the room, being taken around by her helper, having to meet and shake hands with everyone at the fucking party. And I felt really sorry for her. I was like, why does she have to do the hard work while everyone else is just fucking kicking back and having a good time? But she came up to me and she met me, and it was right around the release of My Humps. And I've gone like, hi Fergie, name's Josh, lovely to meet you. I love My Humps. And it just felt like an awkward, she was very nice, oh, thank you, and then moved on to the next person. But, it was a fun little awkward time when I met Fergie. Anyway.
That's cool, actually. Awesome.
So the number one movie was Snakes on a Plane.
Enough is enough! I have had it with these motherfucking snakes on this motherfucking plane! Everybody strap in. We're about to open some fucking windows.
And dropping 1.12 on us may have been a bit like dropping snakes on a plane. It was a big patch. So we start with this one, Cross-Realm BGs. Such a controversial point for so many people. Tell us your thoughts about it.
I definitely think it changed a lot as far as realms, because you'd really forge these rivalries with certain players and against certain guilds you'd see, NPGs, because you'd fight one another constantly throughout the life of the server, right? And I think Cross-Realm Battlegrounds definitely helped do away with that, because you're still seeing generally the same batch of players for the most part, but you're not going to see the same people consistently over and over and over, game in and game out, usually at least. So it was a big change. I think it was good to reduce queue times, especially during off hours, considering it's not like private servers where you have people from all around the world playing, and the server's always pretty populated. I'm sure the server numbers dips pretty low, like the early maybe between like midnight and like 6 a.m. on weekdays, and even later, like on NA realms, because most people are working, right, or in school. So I think it might have helped to combat like hour plus long queue times during those times, which is definitely a good thing. It did definitely help remove parts of the more social aspect, again, forming those bonds and those rivalries with certain players. But it was probably a good change at the end of the day. It probably would, depending on how they do server caps in Classic, it may or may not be a necessary change. Again, especially if they keep the ranking system how it is, that really hangs off of that, in my opinion, first and foremost. But it may or may not be a necessary change in vanilla, depending on how big the server caps are and what the honor system is like, if it's the same or if they do end up changing it.
All right. Now, I'll ask a listener question from listener of the show, Hellbop, who put this one in the Countdown to Classic Discord, saying, how does Mark feel about Classic starting at 1.12? Does he think Blizzard should retune dungeons to match the power increase in player talents? He's like one of the only other content creators that I pay attention to besides yourself, Josh, so be nice to Marky.
I definitely am. Like I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, I'm strictly against 1.1. I'm a huge proponent for doing 1.12. If Blizzard wanted to buff things a little bit to compensate for damage increases from 1.12 talents, I wouldn't really be against it. It's not like the encounters are going to be that much harder. They're just going to be a little bit slower. That's all it's going to be at the end of the day. We just had a really strong raid in our guild on Northdale on Thursday. We killed Lucifron in 18 seconds. Wow. Like it's a good guild with a lot of good players in it and really high DPS. So if that fight was 30 seconds instead because they increased the health pool, that's fine. Either way, I don't mind at the end of the day, whichever way they end up going with it though.
All right. Now, rogues were the class that got their significant, I use that term in quotations, talent overhaul here, because I took a look at it, and again, people know that I played a rogue back in the day, but I was a filthy casual. I just ran around sort of not really knowing what was going on. 1.12 brought the reset of talents for rogues and a few changes, but when I looked through the patch notes, to me as a layman, it doesn't look like much was changed. Is that a fair assessment by myself for what happened to rogues in 1.12?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, the rogues were in a really strong spot early on in vanilla. And I don't know the specifics of the talent revamp, so I can't really comment on it, honestly. But I do know they were in a strong spot early on in vanilla. And if you, like you mentioned yourself, you noticed that there weren't a whole lot of change that happened, then they're really, it really just points to how strong rogues were early on in vanilla, considering how strong they still are in 1.12. Never mind in 1.1 with the majority of classes having a lot of their core abilities either not exist or exist as 31-point talents and not having those other super strong ones that they might have gained later on in the patch or the expansion. So,
alrighty. Now, that's about it. Look, we made it through. That's all 12 major patches. I just want to put one last sort of all-encompassing listener question to you. And this comes from listener of the show, Nostalgia Dad, who's so good with sending through questions for these podcasts. And he says this: if we operate under the no changes banner, as many of us do, how do we pass that with all the class changes that occurred along each patch? Some changes were considered great, while others not. For example, I mained a hunter from vanilla through Wrath of the Lich King. The 1.7 patch changed some things, like talent trees, for the better, but also changed the way the traps could be used in combat. The warrior patch, for instance, made them beasts of both PvP and PvE. They were good before that, but they became the de facto top DPS raid slot afterwards. At the same time, the Shaman, Druid, and Paladin patches didn't really fix the imbalances that these classes had, and in fact weren't really fixed until Burning Crusade. So, if Blizzard did fix these classes that didn't get better optimized until Burning Crusade for Classic, what effect do you think that would have on Classic and a potential TBC? So if I can summarize what they're saying a little bit in this is, if they moved forward what happened in the Burning Crusade and put that in Classic, do you think that would be obviously a drastic change, and what would the effects be? And also, how would that change what they plan to do for Burning Crusade Classic?
Yeah, I mean, things would change a lot, especially in vanilla. As far as raid meta goes, PvP metas go, a whole lot would be changing. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of like what specifically might change in raids and such. Like it might be a lot more like Branker City where you bring like maybe one elemental shaman, maybe one moonkin, like maybe one of the hybrid specs just to kind of gate their buffs for one of the groups in the raid and to kind of have that extra utility they bring with them. But I don't think it would change much as far as like, Fury Warriors are still going to top the meters, followed by Rogues, and then, downwards from there. I'm definitely obviously under the no changes banner for sure. I don't think they should really revamp those classes. They still have their niches in most of the game. Like Elemental Shamans are extremely strong in PvP. Enhanced is one where they're not really great at anything. Resto is still really good in PvE. Holy Paladins are insanely good in PvE and PvP. Prot is... I'm actually surprisingly fine with like a prop tank in like a 5 or 10 man dungeon. They have insanely good AoE threat. The only issue is they lack taunt for bosses. That's the big thing of why they're be tanking in raids ever really. Ret Paladin, same thing, have it as enhanced. They're really not great at anything per se. And then, as I mentioned before, Feral Druid is not bad. Their DPS isn't awful early on. Even off tanking later on in vanilla, they're not bad at all. Like I said, my guild on Lightbringer had Feral Druid off tanking in AQ40 without much of an issue, if any at all. So that was totally fine. Balance is going to be another one of those things where they're not great, but hey, if you have a spellcaster group with a balanced druid, the 5% crit, they're definitely not complaining about it. I remember on Chronos 1, my vanilla guild had a boomkin in it for whatever reason, and if I was a caster in that group that day, I was totally fine with it because they increased my personal DPS at least. And then Resto Druids, yeah, you really only bring one or two to a raid. Still, but they can do extremely strong healing still. They bring a lot of utility. They're not the worst class. Obviously, priests, paladins, charms kind of do their job better, but they are still definitely a necessary component to raid composition.
All right, real quick. Now that we've done everything, outside of patch 1.12, can you think of your top 3 patches that are favorites of yours?
So my top favorite patches?
Yeah, do you have a top, like, let's say, is there a number 1, or could you name a couple that you can single out as I loved what they did with this patch?
I would probably say Emerald Drake patch, so 1.8, and I love that patch. Wow. I love Emerald Drakes. The world PvP is so much fun. It's a huge deal because there's 4 of them in the world, so if you have a strong coalition of guilds that work together, you can take most of them on your own. If you have proper summoning alt and your Hearthstone set in the right place, by utilizing those things, you can really get around the world super, super fast. So that's a really fun patch. I had a great time on it on Lightbringer on the last server. It was super fun. I think Blackwing Lair is a great patch too, just because, again, this is going from private servers. We're having 1.12 talents and stuff at this point. I think Blackwing Lair is like the epitome of vanilla PvP as well, because every class, I think it's like the most balanced point of vanilla PvP here, where casters are pretty strong at this point and they're not scaling like crazy like they do into AQ and Nax, and melee are still super strong at this point too. They have really good weapons from Blackwing Lair. The ranking weapons are updated. I think this is probably the best point in vanilla for PvP as far as general balance goes, and that's why I really enjoy Blackwing Lair patch as well.
All right, Mark. Well, you've made it through the hard part. With all that done, now it's time for anger management. So, Mark, what we do here on Countdown to Classic is I ask the interviewee to hit me with a bit of rage, a bit of anger. Can you think of something else again that makes you super angry or shitty about Vanilla World of Warcraft? Any rants for us?
Yeah, so actually something that came out recently on Northdale, which is Alterac Valley. I fucking hate AV, and this recent AV patch totally reinstated my absolute hate for that battleground. It's so boring. It's a total PvE, basically just race between both teams. Whoever can kill the enemy team's boss faster wins. And then you have the other assholes who come in inside of turtles. So one of the teams might send 5 or 10 mages back to try to AoE down your raid team and just turtle the game and make it just drag on. And God, I fucking hate AV. I only do it for the rep grind for Exalted for the items because you get really strong items for everything. Healers, tanks, DPS, casters. There's BIS items in AV for everything. So everyone really needs AV Exalted. So I finished my Exalted grind a few days ago, maybe like 4 or 5 days ago now, and I'll never go back again.
All right. Very good. Well, now that you got that off your chest, it's time for Memory Lane. Each episode, I ask the interviewee to hit me with a short, sharp story about their favorite memory or a fond or funny, whatever memory from, obviously, your time with Vanilla. So, Mark, do you have anything funny that comes to mind that we haven't heard about or a fond memory?
From private servers or from back in the day, or does not matter?
Either or, your choice, doesn't matter.
I guess probably the most recent one was killing Kel'Thuzad on Lightbringer with my guild. I raided with them since August of last year, so I've been a part of them for a little over a year now. Really fun guild full of good players and just fun people to be around and just make the game fun. And obviously I raided with them from AQ40 all the way through next terminus, so we finally got our first KT kill back in May. About, I think, a week and a half after Nax release. We didn't kill the first reset. Yeah, we killed it the second reset. We got to 4 horsemen the first reset, and then went through 4 horsemen, obviously the rest of the raid, and then 4 horsemen, Saf, and KT the second reset. So that was awesome. I've been looking forward to that moment for a very long time on private servers. So to finally get to that point with a guild I really enjoyed playing with was definitely a fond memory of mine.
All right, well, why don't you give them a shout out? Any what's the guild's name? Any players in particular you want to say hello to?
Yeah, so you interviewed the guild, the GM actually, AK, so
of
Grizzly. So they get a bad rep on private servers for reasons, mostly because of memes on like WoW servers and stuff. They're really not the people that like Reddit and stuff kind of portray them to be. It's a good group of people who are good players, just like to meme around and have fun. They get a lot, I guess, like a bad rep, but they're full of good people. AK is a great leader. So AK rocks, Dribbles, Digby, Failsome, bunch of people out there. So they always make it a good time.
Fantastic. All right. Well, look, Mark, again, I can't thank you enough for coming on Countdown to Classic and taking the time out of your week for the show. I just want to basically say I'm sure the listeners can't wait to hear from you again. And thanks so much for coming on the Mariah Carey podcast.
Thanks for having me, man. I always have a good time, and it's been over an hour and a half now, and it always seems to fly by, so I'm always happy to come on.
Thanks, mate. We'll speak to you next time.
All right, take care.
And that's everything from dareal MarkyMark for today. Thanks so much yet again to him for once more taking the time out for me and my awkward questions and Mariah Carey references. As you heard, Mark has now been on the show 3 times for an interview, and that's for good reason. I really do enjoy chatting with him. As you can hear, he's clearly very knowledgeable about vanilla World of Warcraft, and also just an all-around fun, nice guy who I'll always have time for on the show. If all goes well, that won't be the last time that you hear from Mark, as I'd love to find another topic to hit him up about in a couple more months' time. But for now, there was a bit of news within the community recently about an update regarding the future of Deadly Boss Mods, an add-on that I'm sure almost everyone listening to this show has spent some time with. And as a result of that news, I reached out to Adam, aka MysticalOS, the man behind DBM, to see if he was open to discussing some of the issues raised in the recent update on the show in a bit more detail. And luckily, Adam got back to me quickly and was absolutely agreeable to coming on today, which I was very, very thankful for. So here's the chat between Adam and myself over the weekend in today's Calling Countdown. All right, we've got another caller on the line now, and I want to say a very big hello and welcome to Countdown to Classic to MysticalOS, or Adam, the author of Deadly Boss Mods. Thanks so much for agreeing to come on the show. Now, Adam, I should say, obviously, just to bring people up to speed, that you've come into the news, I guess you could say, somewhat recently with the forum post that you put up about the state of deadly boss mods, some plans for the future, and also about a bit what's going on with your life at the moment. So if people haven't read that forum post, I would invite them to obviously Google that, chase that up so you can have a bit of information coming into this chat that we're about to have. But if you can just let people know a bit about, a bit more behind the impetus for, that particular post, was it just to give people a bit of a window of insight into what's going on behind the scenes with DBM?
Pretty much. I knew I was stepping down from Mythic rating, and I just wanted to be transparent about it and just explain all the things going on in my life and the development and how I needed to take a small step back from rating and get some time back to, focus on myself and my mother and the house a little bit, and maybe even pick up some side work to pick up some of the slack for the Patreon at the time, because it was doing okay enough to get by, but not doing enough to really do well.
The response that you've received through this post has been fantastic and really, really heartwarming to see the community get behind you, because DBM is obviously something that has now been around for quite some time and people really enjoy the utility of the add-on. Can you tell people a little bit about your history with authoring add-ons, how you got involved and what pushed you to produce DBM?
Well, I came into WoW probably mid-BC. I didn't actually create DBM, but I took it over early on.
Okay.
Because the original authors, Nitram and Tandanu, had stopped playing and pretty much stopped working on the mod, and I took it over early on and have been working on it for like the last 9-10 years or so. But basically at first I noticed the updates were getting more sparse, and I was just contributing code on my own. And then they sort of like, well, we'll give you access to the repo and you can just commit your code directly. And then from there, they basically quit the game and it was just me, and it's pretty much been just me since. And I've taken DBM a long way since back then, adding tons of features and doing all the mods myself, and occasionally getting help here and there when I could, especially the localizers, which help bring it to other languages. They're helpful. There's only about 3 of those, but they're very helpful. And it's gone from there. I was pretty much just self-taught.
Now, you talked about how obviously you are you're a one-man band. Now, the one thing that I found going through forum posts about DBM and seeing the community's sentiment towards the work that goes into the add-on is that people just presume it is very much so a team. Oh, there must be multiple people working on DBM. It's such a great add-on, but it's just you pulling all the strings. So can you tell people how much work goes into DBM and how much time you put into the add-on?
Quite a bit, and it's variable depending on what's going on. Like right now, I guess technically the PTR started yesterday, but it doesn't really work yet. But when there's no PTR going on, then it's just working on the live mods, doing support on Discord, getting user feedback, doing the encounters myself, testing things, and just constantly improving the mods that are already done. And then when there's a beta or PTR, then it gets really busy, because then on top of the stuff I'm doing on live, I'm logging into the PTR and beta for all the scheduled tests. And between the scheduled tests, I'm making sure all the APIs are updated and the mods are working correctly. They rework the combat log or they change some map code or something, and everything's got to be updated in the mod constantly to work with the latest PTRs and live at the same time, so that people who are doing both can just use the same mod.
What's been the hardest thing? Do you have a particular moment of frustration to implement with DBM? One thing that you just really, really, really struggled to get around with the mod?
Well, the core part of DBM is it's mod for team content. So naturally, when I need to do the PTR or beta or even live, I need a team to do it. So it can be frustrating at times when I get on the PTR for a raid test, and it's just one of those days where, players gave short notice, or there just aren't a lot of people in the guild that are available that day, and it's just, I can't really field a good group to get good data, so sometimes it can be frustrating when I'm ready to work and I'm being held back because, sometimes I just don't have the group to do it.
In terms of, we've obviously just spoken about frustrations, but in terms of the rewards that you feel you get from your work on DBM, just in terms of, do you get like a sense of fulfillment? Do you feel great about the work that you put in, you know, obviously increasing the enjoyment for so many people around the world with the game?
Absolutely. That's one of the core things that I get out of DBM, even when I was frustrated with the amount of time and hours putting in and the months where I didn't really bring in that much money compared to what it should have been bringing in at that time for the hours put in. But I still always appreciate the community response and the end result. And also I just like solving puzzles in general. I like figuring out how things work, not just downing bosses, but understanding every interesting mechanic and sub-mechanic that most people don't even realize. Like I was talking about in the Discord earlier, someone was asking about the mother timers, and I was explaining there's far more complexity to how the encounter works than people just realize, and it's my job to figure those things out so the mod can work seamlessly around them. And that's always fun to me, to solve those puzzles.
Now, as you're aware, obviously this show is a very much so a classic-related podcast, and I understand that your work on DBM is continuing on through this day, through all the expansions that World of Warcraft goes through, but I'm not sure if you've sort of paid any attention at all to what might be going on with the Classic project, but once Classic releases, do you have any plans whatsoever in releasing a Classic-friendly version of DBM?
Very much so. In fact, I've been planning ahead for that for a long time. Like when all the big streamers were doing Project 60, I was very involved in hopping in all the streams, watching them do the encounters, watching them use my mods, and seeing areas where I can improve them for when those encounters become relevant again for real. Like, I was literally in Chinglish's and Soda streams and Vajira, like all of them would be open on the screen at the same time and they'd be running DBM. And I would be collecting feedback and actually updating the mods on the spot for Project 60, because in my head, I wasn't just updating it for Project 60. I was forward thinking, so if I do the work I did then would be less work I had to do for when Classic came out. So I was trying to, get ahead of things. And I even did the same thing for Project 70 and 80 as well. So those mods actually received significant updates not even that long ago. The only thing I need to figure out now is how the API is going to work for Classic. My understanding is they're specifically quoting it the Classic experience because it's actually going to be based on the 8.0 API, not 1.0 API. So current add-on feature set, not Classic feature set. And I'm hoping that's true because that means all the features I've added over the years, for the most part, should be able to be ported back to Classic WoW. But if I do have to use a 1.0 feature set of the API, then a lot of features will still have to be stripped back to make it work.
And the work that you'll have to do on it, if that worst case scenario does come up, my general blanket question would be, a lot of people presume that we're going to have Classic dropped on us and the API will be something that, won't be necessarily ready to go with any of the add-ons out there. So people will have to develop or at least heavily tinker with their add-ons in order to make it Classic friendly. So what kind of time frame do you think we'd be looking at in terms of add-ons slowly starting to come through to the Classic community? Do you think we'll go through a fortnight without anything, a month without anything? What would you guess?
Honestly, I think it's really hard to say because I feel like there's going to be some hybridization of the API. If it is based on 8.0 API, it's still going to have to use 1.0 mechanics. Like, you're not going to have dual spec or anything like that, so there's still going to be a lot of code refactoring, so you have to do something that's sort of in between modern and Classic. Like, it's going to take a while, I think, for any add-on to be updated, especially a big one like DBM.
Now,
I couldn't give you a time frame on that because we just have to wait and see.
No, I completely appreciate that. I understand it's complete speculation at this point. But in figuring out the kind of work that you might have ahead of you for a potential port over to Classic, are there any headaches already that you can see coming that you're thinking, oh, God, I'm not looking forward to that?
Well, the biggest thing was literally just logistics. I'm one man, so I always thought ahead that to ever support Classic and Live at the same time, I would need to be more than one man. That's actually why one of my, the goals I hadn't reached until the recent campaign, one of them said Classic support, because I already knew there's just no way I was going to be able to support Classic by myself. I would need help for that because Classic is a big time sink, probably bigger than Live when it comes to, that's just what Classic is. So the idea of, raiding in Classic, testing the mods in Classic, and making sure, everything works, and still doing Live was just an impossible task at the time. But thanks to all this community support, I can now look into, the expansion necessary to do such an endeavor.
In all the encounters that you've scripted within your time on DBM within the game, is it everything pretty much the same at this point, or is there any one encounter that you remember like, oh God, that was annoying to work on?
There have been a few annoying work on encounters, but the ones that are my least favorite are council-based fights, because it always feels like if it's a 3-boss encounter, it just feels like 3 times the work to do that one mod, because you basically treat each boss in the encounter as a separate entity with its own timers, its own abilities, and you do each of them one at a time and then put them together. And then you got to figure out in the mod, well, how do I present this successful information in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming? So then you have to figure out option defaults and just better ways to present it so it's just not overwhelming, because a console-based fight could easily have 12 plus timers and like 15 different warnings, so you just gotta figure out that mod in a more complex scale than, say, a boss like Feta Devour, which is straight and forward. He does a knockback, he does a breath, and he beats up the tanks.
Okay, now what I do here on the show that you might not be aware of is I read a number of forum posts to guests at times, and the show very much so is a debate-focused show in terms of we present both sides of an argument, both for and against, and sort of go on the merits of each side. And I just want to read out a few forum posts to you. And with this first one, the reason I'm giving you this preamble is I don't want you to think this is an attack of any kind. It's not at all. But I want to sort of go through what the community has perceived as the pros and cons of DBM in the past, and then get your comment on what their thoughts were. So please just bear with me for about 2 minutes while I read this out to you. And I just ask that you pay a bit of attention, and there are specific points that I'll ask you about at the end of this. So on the WoW Classic subreddit, we've got user Sedja, who says the following about Classic WoW and DBM and its place in the game. And they say this: Hi all, I'm unsure if this has been brought up in the past, but I feel like it warrants its own discussion. Deadly boss mods. This mod is one I think has actually hurt the raiding community more than any other since its inception. It has led the community down the path of essentially telling raiders exactly what to do in every encounter since early vanilla. I personally never liked the mod because I think repeated failure is the best way to learn and improve your skills as a player. Stepping in a fire and being told to move out of the way seems pretty self-explanatory to me. I believe it's gone so far that to actually mold the gameplay of endgame raiding in retail WoW. If there was to be post-Nax content, I think it would be great not to have deadly boss mods in place, as it would allow the learning process to take place at a more steady rate. Blah, 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 blah. I'll then read a response post from user Devising, who says this: Deadly boss mods were available since boss mods in general were available since the first day we entered Molten Core. They form part of the vanilla and WoW experience, and most of its features have been added to the Blizzard UI. They form part of the core World of Warcraft experience, and fights were designed with them in mind, and some are outright impossible without them. To say that DBM hurts the raiding community since its inception, well, there never was a raiding community before Deadly Boss mods, and raids did nothing but improve after their inception. And then one final post from user Cameron Wolf, who says this: DBM is a pretty important add-on for community health, since it helps to close the gap between new players who are interested in completing high-level content for the first time and veteran players who already know it. Most people don't enjoy explaining mechanics, and they get frustrated when simple mechanics are failed by inexperienced players, and will tend to exclude players who aren't known to be experienced. So, thank you so much for sitting through all of that. Here's my question for you. How do you feel about the effects of DBM on the community? Do you understand the pros and the cons, and what would you say to some of the points raised both for and against DBM there?
A lot of those points were pretty good points, especially the points about the encounters getting better with boss mods. The encounter, or Blizzard themselves have admit that boss mods have pushed them to go further with encounters. They've gotten more complex, complicated, and just overall interesting versus, classic mechanic that had like one living bomb and you spammed the curse on the raid. Like that was, if you had an encounter like that today, people would be like, WTF Blizzard, what is this? This is not what we expect from an encounter, because they've been spoiled over the years of constant improvement, and a lot of that improvement has been pushed and inspired by boss mods and the community as a whole as we get better players. Another thing to consider too is even if, let's say, they did eliminate boss mods at this point, there's been a lot of other changes that have changed the way we approach encounters. We're basically a lot more knowledgeable now. WoWhead's far more advanced. PTR testing has gotten far more engaging. In Classic, you didn't have this long PTR cycle where you tested all the bosses 2 or 3 times before they even reached live, and by the time you had live, you already had fat boss videos telling you how the fight works. That's not DBM's fault that you know how the fight works before you pull it for the first time. That's just community knowledge. So you can't really say DBM really had a huge impact on the evolution of encounter difficulty, because it's really the community that's done so, more so than the boss mods themselves.
Yep, fair point, absolutely. Look, I invite listener questions as well, and we seem to have hit on one particular topic that I wanted to ask you about, because listener Hellbop raises the same point when he asks this. Can you please ask MysticalOS how he feels about add-ons affecting the health of WoW over time? Former game designer Kevin Jordan recently expressed displeasure with the fact that game developers are designing encounters around DBM in retail World of Warcraft, describing it as a slippery slope and invoking the DBM-required stigma. There's also a lot of sentiment in the Classic community that add-ons have gone too far, creating meta addicts and reducing the mystery of raid mechanics down to gimmicky sound effects. Now, my question flowing on from that is, you raised earlier your point that, and I found that really interesting, I didn't realize that Blizzard themselves have commented on DBM pushing them to obviously make more interesting and perhaps more in-depth encounters. But when you sort of get that synergy, do you find that DBM is now mandatory in a way? And how do you feel about that?
At the top level, mods pretty much absolutely are mandatory. DBM or even big rigs and weak Rs are pretty much the standard requirement for mythic rating at this point. You just don't go into them without it. That said, I feel like Blizzard has done a better job at improving visuals and alerts so that people could still do it without mods on a normal and heroic level. And looking for raid, you could obviously go there and ignore the mechanics and still do the fight. So you can't say DBM is really required there. But at the top level, absolutely it's required. But they also designed the top level for mods in mind, because that's just what they expect. If you're a cutting edge guild, they expect you to have these mods. If you're a normal raiding guild, they've improved on things over the year. And I wanted to bring up another point about mods making the game easier. This huge feedback I've been getting the last few days has made me realize one thing, that one important point that hasn't been brought up a lot, and that's accessibility to the disabled. I've actually gotten a lot of messages from people who are either hard of sight or hard of hearing, who said that they couldn't raid without the help of DBM. Like, Blizzard might have stuff on the ground, but they have poor eyesight and don't see it very well, so DBM making audibles helps them move out of it. In the same contrast, other people who have audible issues appreciate the flashes that DBM does on the screen to help see things, like ability incoming, and then that flashing the screen and all that. And accessibility was something I tried to improve over the past few years when I greatly improved sound customization and the UI flash to be more customizable with durations, flash frequency, colors, transparency, all that. The flash stuff I improved quite a bit. I think it was sometime in WAD, and I got a lot of positive feedback about that too. But basically, Blizzard is not always the best at making things accessible to people with needs, and people have said DBM has helped fill that gap quite a bit over the years.
I just want to say, just so obviously the listeners are clear and yourself as well. I use DBM. I love DBM. I'm all for it. I think it absolutely has a place in Classic when it comes out, and I think you're doing an amazing job. I hope you haven't taken it personally or anything when I obviously present a little bit of the other side of the coin to you and get some critical analysis from you from what some other people might say about it. So I hope that was okay.
Oh yeah, I can understand. I actually get involved in these discussions quite a bit. And even Blizzard realizes that the base UI is lacking and DBM has helped fill holes over the years. But as they've taken features away from DBM, they've improved the core game. Like, they actually killed the radar in DBM in 7.1. But after they did so, they made a conscious effort to improve the visuals with a lot of debuffs. Like, a lot of things now draw circles around your character that didn't used to. And they don't do that because they were trying to make the game easier. They're doing it because they realized they gutted the functionality of the mod and wanted to compensate for it, which goes again to show that they do design encounters around these features in mind, because when they take those features away, they try to compensate you for it.
Okay, now I'll just take you to one more listener question that's a little bit off the beaten track, and this is perhaps more of, I'll say, is in relation to add-ons in general, but they get quite specific, and I'll ask you this one. This is from listener Prism, who says this. An essential piece of information for hunters is knowing exactly how far away you are from your target, given the different range requirements for their abilities. 0 to 5 yards for melee, 5 to 8 for dead zone, 0 to 20 for scatter, and 8 to 41 for ranged. But there has never been an add-on to display this information, even though it appears to be available to the interface through action bar colorization. Do you think it's possible to make an add-on that would show you in real time how far away you are from your target? So I'll add a little bit of an addendum onto that question. Basically, firstly, do you think that hunter add-on would be possible? And then flowing on from that, if you can just let people know broadly, what is and isn't kind of possible with add-ons? Is it everything?
Actually, that mod does somewhat exist. Actually, there's actually a few mods that do something similar, but the API is severely limiting. They basically use a bunch of spell ranges to check range and distance to a target and then give you an estimate on your screen. I think one add-on might be called spell range. I forget what. I don't know. But there are add-ons that do that to an extent. But the reason why it's not done like fully is because the API just severely limits it. For example, there is no API to tell you the range to a target on your screen whatsoever. You can't just say, how far away is this target? Or where is this target on my screen? They absolutely forbid that. And for good reason, because with that information, you can automate some things they do not want automated. So instead, add-ons, the best they can do is go, okay, well, let's query your spell book and check if spell in range returns true or false. This spell is a 30-yard range. Can it be cast on the boss? True. Okay, we're within 30 yards of the boss. Now let's check your 20-yard spell, etc. And it goes forward and backwards until it gets a guesstimate. It'd be like, okay, well, we checked 10 of your spells, and based on this, the boss is within X and Y yards from your position, and that's about the best add-ons can do.
Just sort of getting towards the tail end of this call, you mentioned at the top that you've obviously been caring for your mother and that some personal circumstances have come up and made you sort of reassess the way in which you approach DBM. As much as you're comfortable with, if I can just ask you, and you summarized it a little bit in your forum post, if I could just get you to tell us on the personal side of things what's going on and sort of, are you doing okay, and what you sort of have going on in the periphery while you also try to manage this behemoth that is DBM?
Me and my mother live in southeast Georgia, where her and my stepfather built a home quite a few years back, but he died a few years back, and she's been widowed, and I've been here with her, helping her, not just physically, but financially too. She couldn't manage this house on her own because she's got just a low Social Security income and her own medical expenses to deal with. So I help financially while also helping, be around for her, if she has a fall or if she needs me to take her somewhere, like to the hospital or something, or to the doctor. And she's just turned 70. She's got physical disability because of back issues, and shoulder issues and leg issues, from just general aging and also car accident. On top of that, she also has Crohn's disease. I don't know if you know about that, but it's a pretty annoying disease, which requires expensive medication, Humira, which thankfully her insurance covers as part of her Social Security, because we damn sure couldn't afford that otherwise. But she just needs more supervision than help. Like, I do help her around the house a lot, but she still gets around on her own stuff. But for the most part, I like being here because I can keep an eye on her. I'm constantly walking in the other room, making sure she's all right, if she's been quiet for a while, things like that. And it's just been a huge relief to be able to work at home from DVM and be available in that capacity as a caregiver and just make sure that she's all right and she has help whenever she needs it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing, obviously, that bit of personal information and letting people know a bit more about what's going on behind the scenes. I just want to wrap up this call with a few more forum posts, and these pertain to, obviously, you and the work that you do. And again, please just bear with me a little bit while I rattle through a few of these. And we'll start with some posts that have come up over at the DBM forums. And the first is from user Savison, who says this: "Man, I've been around since vanilla and have always used DBM. I figured it had to be done by a team of people. I mean, the updates are so constant, and I can't think of many times where I went, man, DBM failed me. I always joked about the air horn sound effect when it changed, thinking it must have been one person from the group who came up with the idea. To read that you have maintained DBM the entire time single-handedly is mind-blowing to me. The amount of time and dedication you put into WoW with so little in return. You seriously are amazing. You have contributed more to WoW than anyone else I can think of. I hope you can step back and take a breather and get life straightened out. Your health is most important, and I don't think anyone would blame you for cutting back on DBM, or even if you quit, and anyone who does can go and stuff themselves. Best of wishes to you and thank you again." And the next post is this one from user Games and Booze, who says, "I've honestly never even thought about who makes DBM. It's just been there for me, quietly making things easier or better in the game that I love. I came back from a long hiatus this expansion and was late or lazy in getting add-ons again. My dungeon experience before and after DBM was absolutely night and day. I've sent you a donation, and I hope you understand that at least for me, and I hope others, that is strictly payment for past services rendered, not a request to keep pushing yourself to continue. Please consider taking a long or even permanent break to get yourself in a better place. Thanks so much for everything you have done for the community." And finally, this one from user Kylista, who says this: "You have always been and always will be one of the unsung heroes of World of Warcraft. The overwhelmingly positive effect that you've had on millions of players, from the most casual and family-oriented players to the most hardcore world-first contenders. Still to this day, you are one of the most receptive, reachable mod creators out there, able to turn around and code out requests with an insanely fast turnaround. Mod or add-on, I feel, is not a strong enough word to convey how integral your creation has become over the years. On behalf of the entire World of Warcraft community, I wish you the best of luck. Thank you so much for everything you've done for us all." So now I want to add something onto that, and I want to obviously say thank you as well, and reflect the sentiment that's been thrown your way from those posts, and just say, from the World of Warcraft Classic community, I'm sure there are many people in this community that want to say thank you as well. And I just want to shout out to, obviously, the Patreon that I think was alluded to very earlier. You have people, please go over and find patreon.com/deadlybossmods. You can find a way to support Adam even further with DBM. And also, Adam, I'd ask you as well, do you happen to have PayPal?
I do, actually. And I remember somebody had pinned both the Patreon and the PayPal in the Reddit post at one point. But the PayPal link is on the curse page for DBM, actually, in the corner. And PayPal is appreciated too, but I do actually prefer PayPal because it gives future sustainability. But I absolutely understand some people just want to support once and that's it.
Right. So
but
you prefer
PayPal's
Patreon, you mean, with the future sustainability?
Correct.
Yeah.
Like I've had months where I've made posts not as detailed as one before, but people would get to be a surge of one-time donations. Then the next month it's back into barely having enough again. So But that's not a problem now, and I'm very grateful for the community response in that. And going forward, I hope the Patreon continues, not necessarily to grow. I think it's grown more than enough, but I hope it maintains its momentum and that half the people don't drop out next month, because it's a constant thing going forward, and sustainability is an important model for continuing to do mod creation full time and expanding to a larger team as well.
And I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot and obviously shower you with praise with a few people who have posted online about the work that you've done, but I presume that you must come across some feedback and be aware of the effect that you're having on people and their experience in the game.
I'm always reading feedback and lurking, and even if I'm not necessarily commenting, I'm always lurking. I might even be in your stream one day and you'll not even realize the DBM guy is watching your stream simply because you're using DBM. I'll pass up your stream if you're not using DBM, because I'll be in your stream because I'm not just interested in what you're doing on stream, but I'm interested in how you're using my mod, and I want to see, do they change default settings? Are they receptive to my mod, or do they just kind of tunnel it out and use weak auras instead? Things like that. And that brings up to a point you mentioned earlier, the air horn. The reason why that sound was changed is because I saw a very common thing in a lot of streams and a lot of raiders in general. You'd go into a new raid, and people would be doing these bosses, and they'd be messing up a mechanic repeatedly, even though it has a warning in DBM, and I'd be like, well, why are they messing it up? What's wrong with the DBM warning that's not adequate enough? And they'd be constantly making these weak auras, and the go-to sound for any weak aura is pretty much always the air horn. Be like, oh, well, I need to put an air horn on it so I react to it better. So I was thinking, okay, well, maybe I can fix that then. I'll just make the default sound for anything that's high priority, the air horn. And when I did, it was pretty mixed. It was half and half. It was, oh, finally, now I know what warnings are important and what ones to pay the most attention to. And then there was the other ones who were like, you're blasting my ears off. What the hell's wrong with you? This sound is awful. So it was like, I didn't really win or lose there, but that was the basic concept behind changing the sound, was based on my observations of the community and just general feedback of people saying, over time, they had just gotten so, DBM has used the same sounds for the last 10 years that with no change up, they've gotten to a point where it's background noise. They don't even hear it anymore. So new defaults came about in that sense to, mix it up and make it fresh and productive again. And that's also why voice packs have been a big thing now too, is because as encounters have more and more sounds and more alerts, distinction is more important than ever. If you've got 5 different warnings that all say beware, then when you hear it, your mind won't register what you're hearing because there's too many things using that same sound. But if you're using a voice pack that's very specific, it's far more productive.
All right, Adam. Well, look, thank you so much for all the knowledge that you've dropped on us today. I know there's a lot of add-on aficionados who would have loved the knowledge bombs that you were dropping on us and sort of hearing a bit more about you. Do you mind if I ask, do you happen to have your phone handy at the moment?
Yes.
Okay, bear with me one moment. All right, Adam. Well, look, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. I don't normally sort of publicize this kind of thing, but I'm not sure if you've just seen pop up. I have just sent you $50, and that is a thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the work that you've done in the past. And the reason I'm doing this on air in an interview is I want the listeners to sort of try and get behind and support Adam if you can. As I've talked about, you've got the Patreon website, which I really encourage people to go over and look at to see if they can if they can find a reward or a tier that they'd like to sign up for. You've got the PayPal links. I'm more than happy to donate to someone like you with all the work you've done and obviously what you're dealing with at the moment. And I'm not sure if that notification popped up. I hope it did, but I just wanted to say thank you so much.
It did pop up. And one important point I want to stress too is I never want anyone to overextend just because they read my story or whatever. The intent of my story was not for make people to feel bad and just dump their entire wallet on me. I didn't really want that to happen. Some people might have done that. Some people understood that my firm belief has always been a lot of people giving a little, not a few people giving a lot. I never want one person to, like I had people approach me and go, oh yeah, I'll send you $1,000 towards that computer, and I would tell them flat out, no, I don't want that. I'd rather have 1,000 people give $1 than one person give 1,000, because no one's going to miss $1, but 1,000 is going to make me feel bad, and that's always been my firm belief, which is why I'm glad the Patreon went from 500 to almost 3,000 supporters, because that's how you sustain a project long term. Someone who gives a lot can't do that every month. You're back to the same problem 3 months down the road when those people who overextended have to pull back, and then you're back to low numbers again. I'd rather have a bunch of people give $1, $2, and give up one McDouble a month and not think about it again and not miss it. That's important to me, because I don't want anyone to be hurting just so someone else isn't hurting.
Totally understand where you're coming from, and that's very well put. And look, Adam, again, just thank you so much for taking the time for this call and for agreeing to be on the show. We really do appreciate it. And just thank you again on behalf of the Classic community for everything that you've done.
My pleasure. And I hope that Blizzard doesn't make it too difficult to get Classic mods out to you guys right away. But if it takes a month, it takes a month. But we'll just find out when we get to that bridge.
Thanks, mate. All right, we'll talk to you later.
Take care.
And with that call done, that's the show for the day, everyone. Thanks so much again to Adam for being so open to coming on the show and talking about the things that he did. I really do appreciate it. Now, I'm not 100% sure if I can bring you a second episode at the end of this week, as I'm done moving now, but unfortunately I'm now going through the long and painful task of unpacking. So we'll just have to wait and see how I go. But please do stay tuned to Countdown to Classic next week, as I have got some very special calls lined up for you, involving even more former vanilla World of Warcraft developers. And those will be chats that I'm sure you will not want to miss, as we break down even more of the unknown tales of the making of World of Warcraft. But just before I let you go, I just want to shout out to some very dedicated patrons of Countdown to Classic. So shout out to Flozy B, Palfurus, Permadrunk, Rarebit, Romani, The Anton, Wilson Ma, and Valaco. Thank you so much for your phenomenal support of the show. Countdown to Classic would not be the same without your support. And also a big thank you to supporters Bossman764, Hurlbert, Good Kisser, Myrtlebanks, Pogatos81, and Zudamos as always. That's it from me for the day, everyone. So signing off from Down Under. Have a great week, everyone.